Today what I'm going to talk about is something that I actually learned a little bit more about when I studied writing in college. Character-driven stories versus plot-driven stories. Maybe you know all about this, or maybe these terms are completely new to you, but regardless, I think it's really helpful to be aware of these things when you're writing, when you're reading, or even just when you're watching movies or TV. And before I really get into it, I want to just throw out a little reminder. Stories are not math. There's no mathematical calculation. You can't just put things in nice, neat little boxes and categories. There's a lot of gray areas. There's a lot of overlap between these two. So just be aware of that. So first, character-driven. What exactly is a character-driven story? When you're studying writing, or even when you're just sort of observing a story really closely, you'll notice that there tend to be two different sort of aspects you see. The characters and the plot of the story. In a character-driven piece, you're going to find that the characters themselves sort of propel that story. There's a lot more internal development and focus, and you're going to find that you're going to have a lot more paragraphs or minutes, in the case of movies and TV shows, where you're just seeing the character change somehow or sort of ponder over something. It's a journey, it's a progression internally within a character, within a set of characters. I first really started reading a lot of character-driven literature when I was studying, and we read a lot of literary fiction. On the other hand, what some might consider to be the opposite end of the literary spectrum, rom-coms, for example, also tend to be character-driven. Things happen in the story, of course, but the reason you're watching the movie, or the reason you're reading the book, is because there's something interesting about the characters and what's going on, and there's something changing, and the character needs to learn something, or overcome something, or whatever the case happens to be. But it's much more focused on the characters than it is the things that are happening. Some other examples would be A Christmas Carol, for example. Of course, things are happening to Scrooge. He doesn't choose for the ghost to appear to him or anything, but the story itself is set up upon Scrooge and his internal journey and becoming a better person. The Fault in Our Stars would be another example. Really anything that tends to be really romantic or focused solely on a relationship or mostly on a relationship, that tends to be character-driven. Plot-driven stories are, you probably guessed it, more focused on the plot. There are characters, there are interesting things about the characters, but really what keeps the plot moving are the things that are happening in the world outside of the characters. A lot of sci-fi and fantasy tends to be very plot-driven. For example, Lord of the Rings. Obviously, you have a fantastic set of characters, you have progressions, you have things going on internally, but really, when you look at the crux of the story, most people are probably going to talk about the ring, and its journey, and destroying the ring, and what's happening to Middle-earth, and all these things that are keeping the plot moving. Really save the world type of plots do tend to be very plot-driven. A really important thing to remember, though, is that a good story has both of these things. You cannot have a really good story if nothing happens outside of the character's own mind. Except for maybe a short story, you could pull that off, but if you have a novel, if you have a 2-hour movie, something better happen. I mean, imagine how ticked off you'd be if you paid $10 for a movie ticket and you just went in and sat and watched someone think for a while and then you left. Like, seriously? At the same time, if the characters are flat and they're boring and nothing ever happens and the same person that you started with is the same person you end the story with, you don't really care about what's happened. What's the point? So obviously in a story you need good characters, you need a good plot, you need both. But often you tend to focus a little more on one or the other. And that's why we make this distinction between character-driven and plot-driven. You'll also find that when a story is lacking in something, when you don't find a story very satisfying, it's because it's weak in one of these areas, because the author tends to be a little bit stronger in the other. So for example, if you read a book and at the end you find yourself saying stuff like, nothing really happened, or it was just so boring, it's probably because the plot wasn't strong enough. It was too character-driven. But if you say stuff like, the characters were just so annoying, or they were so flat, they were so predictable, that's because it wasn't strong enough in the character-driven aspect. They were focusing too much on the things that were happening, and nobody really cared about the people they were happening to. When you're trying to identify what type of story you have, it can be quite difficult, because like I said, there's a lot of overlap, there are a lot of stories that, I mean, you have to have both. But often a little trick that I like to use, it's not always an accurate representation of the whole story itself, but try to just explain it to a friend. How would you explain that story? So for example, for Lord of the Rings, would you say it's a story about how a young hobbit or a man has to struggle with facing things that he's never faced before, and he grows under the influence of this strong power? Well, no, actually, you'd probably just say it's about this powerful ring that this evil lord made, and this group of people have to travel across this entire land and destroy this thing and fight orcs and blah blah blah. Again, it's not always a perfect representation, but it's a pretty good place to start. I could probably keep talking about this, but I'm just gonna stop there for the sake of the time of the video. So let me know in the comments, do you prefer character-driven or plot-driven stories? Thank you guys all so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.